The intake officer at Helion Reach had processed 412 youth delegates in the past 2 cycles. He had seen delegates who wept at the size of the station. He had seen delegates who tried to bribe him at the gate. He had seen a Garathi youth eat the registration form because a translator told him it was a welcome treat. He had never seen anything like the boy at the back of the line. Not because the boy was loud or strange-looking. Humans were new to the Galactic Exchange program, and they all looked roughly the same to him. Soft, small, oddly confident given their complete lack of armor or natural weapons. No, the boy was strange because he was completely still. Every other human in the group was talking, turning their heads, pointing at things. This one stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the room the way a person looks at something they're quietly measuring. And at his left side, low to the ground, was an animal that it was black across the back and white across the top of its head. It was maybe the length of the officer's forearm. It had short, thick legs and a flat, wide face and very small eyes. Those eyes moved across the room the same way the boys did, slow, steady, touching everything once and then moving on. The officer checked his screen. No pre-registered companion fauna for this group. When the boy reached the desk, the officer asked for identification and a declaration of any biological material being brought aboard the station. The boy placed his ID on the desk without speaking. Then he placed a folded datasheet next to it. The officer opened the sheet. It read, Honey Badger, Earth Fauna, Domesticated Companion, Vaccinations Current, No dietary hazards to other species. The officer looked at the sheet. He looked at the animal. The animal looked back at him with those small flat eyes. Nothing in its expression suggested it found him interesting. Nothing in its expression suggested it found anything threatening either. It simply looked at him the way stone looks at water, present, patient, and entirely unmoved. Is it dangerous? The officer asked. The boy looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up both his ID and the datasheet and moved into the station. The officer filed a standard query and moved on to the next delegate. The common hall for youth delegates was a wide, bright space designed to encourage interaction between species. Long tables, open ceilings, soft lighting calibrated to suit 43 different types of vision. It smelled like 16 different kinds of food and the particular nervous energy of several hundred young beings who had all been told this experience would shape their future. Rail Dunmore found a seat at the far end of a table near the wall. He put his bag down. He put a small bowl on the floor next to his chair and filled it with something from a container in his bag. Sable ate from it without any drama. That Silvari delegate sat down across from him about 10 minutes later. She was slender and faintly luminescent in the way of her species. Her skin held a pale glow that shifted slightly when she moved. She had very large eyes and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was used to reading rooms before entering them. She looked at Rail. She looked at Sable. She sat down. I am Lyrian, she said. Your animal is very calm. Rail nodded. Lyrian waited to see if more was coming. It wasn't. She decided to find this acceptable and began eating her own meal. Across the hall, a large Garathi youth named Dura was doing what Garathi youths often did when placed in rooms full of smaller beings. He was testing the edges. Not violently, just loudly. He moved between tables, commenting on things, laughing at things, making sure everyone was aware of how unbothered he was. His species were large, gray-skinned, and built like something that had evolved specifically to win arguments through sheer physical presence. He stopped when he reached Rail's end of the table. He looked down at Rail, then at the animal on the floor. What is that? He said, not asking really, performing the question for the delegates nearby who had turned to watch. Rail did not look up. It is so ugly, Dura said, and a few nearby aliens made sounds that translated roughly as laughter. Like something that was designed by a being who had only ever heard a description of an animal and never actually seen one. Sable stopped eating. She turned her head and looked at Dura. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply looked at him with those small, flat, completely expressionless eyes. The way a mountain looks at weather, Dura looked back. He kept his expression easy, his posture loose. But something shifted behind his eyes. Some very old and very quiet part of his brain. The part that existed before language, before civilization, the part that had kept his ancestors alive on a dangerous world, sent him a message. The message was simple. This animal has no fear response. He laughed again, louder than before, and moved away down the table. Later that night, 3 delegates who had seen the whole exchange looked up Honey Badger on the station's public information system. The results gave them several hours of uneasy reading. One of them checked that their door was locked before sleeping. Just in case, Rail sat by the observation window in his quarters. Sable was pressed against his leg, warm and solid. Outside, the stars were the same as they always were, distant, quiet, and completely indifferent to the opinions of anyone in the room. He had nothing to say about that. He thought it was about right. The orientation hall smelled like recycled air and fresh anxiety. 309 youth delegates sat in curved rows facing a wide projection screen. The session was called Understanding Our Neighbors, and it was, in theory, designed to build empathy across species. In practice, it was the moment every delegation quietly ranked every other delegation based on whose homeworld looked the least likely to kill you. The screen showed planets in alphabetical order by galactic registration. Each one got 90 seconds. The Silvari homeworld looked like something painted by a being who loved color more than restraint. Soft violet skies, enormous flowering trees, rivers that moved slowly enough to seem deliberate. Several delegates made sounds of approval. Lyrian sat straight in her seat and said nothing, but the glow on her skin brightened slightly. The Garathi homeworld was large and red and clearly took great pride in having weather that could strip paint. Dura sat with his arms crossed and looked satisfied. Then Earth came up. The first image was of a desert. Not a clean, photogenic desert. A cracked, pale expanse of rock and dust under a white sky, where the heat came off the ground in waves. The temperature reading appeared in the corner. Several delegates shifted in their seats. The next image was a storm. Not a storm system in space, which every species understood. A storm on the surface of a planet. Lightning hitting the ground in 6 places at once. A wall of gray cloud moving across the land like something alive and annoyed. Then came the animal segment. The narrating system went through several Earth creatures in sequence. The delegates watched a large, 4-legged predator bring down something almost as large as itself. They watched a small, banded insect take down prey 50 times its size through coordinated attack. They watched a slow-moving armored reptile outlast a faster predator through pure indifference to pain. Then the honey badger entry played. The information box appeared on screen. The narrator's voice remained calm and professional throughout. It described the species' distribution, dietary habits, physical characteristics. Then it moved into documented behaviors. Attacks venomous snakes and consumes them entirely. Breaks into active beehives and feeds while being stung hundreds of times. Has been documented engaging large predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, and driving them off. Does not retreat when injured. Has been observed escaping every type of human-made enclosure that has ever been used to contain it. Known in Earth biological records as the most fearless animal on the planet. The hall was very quiet. Lyrian looked across the row to where Rail sat. He was watching the screen. His expression was the same as always, still, reading, saying nothing. Sable was curled under his chair. Asleep, apparently not on screen. The footage showed a honey badger biting the tail of a large snake, getting bitten in return, and then continuing to eat the snake while the venom worked through its system, stopping briefly to sleep off the neurotoxin, and then finishing its meal when it woke up. Someone behind Lyrian whispered to their neighbor, "That is the boy's animal." The neighbor said nothing for a moment. Then he raised it as a companion. Another silence. Voluntarily, the first one added, as if that were the part that needed clarification. The afternoon exercise was cooperative problem solving. Pairs were assigned by the session coordinator with the specific goal of placing delegates from very different species together. The idea was exposure. The result, in many cases, was polite friction. Rail was paired with Dura. Dura looked at the assignment board, looked at Rail, and pulled his chair to the far edge of their shared table. He opened his own materials and began working alone. He did not speak. Rail looked at the task sheet. It was a logistics problem, resource allocation across a system with limited transport options. He worked through it methodically, making small marks on the sheet with a pen he had brought himself because he found styluses imprecise. At the end of the session, the coordinator collected the sheets. Dura had completed about 60% of the problem. His reasoning was solid where it existed, but he had missed two key variables. Rail had completed it fully. The coordinator looked at the sheet for longer than was strictly professional. Dura received a poor mark. He told the delegate next to him at dinner that his partner had refused to cooperate. The delegate nodded and did not ask follow-up questions. Lyrian found Rail after the session, and they walked together toward the observation corridor without deciding to. She talked. He listened. She was beginning to understand that this was simply how he operated. Not rudeness, not disinterest, but a different ratio of input to output than she was used to. She told him that her people experienced emotion as a kind of signal that passed between beings. That words were secondary to the feeling underneath them. That she could sense, when near most delegates, a constant noise of performance and anxiety. Being near you is different, she said. It is like standing next to still water. Rail was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sable is the same. Lyrian looked down at the animal walking between them, steady and low to the ground, watching the corridor ahead without concern. She trusts you completely, Lyrian said. Rail didn't answer. But something in his posture shifted slightly, not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. Later, on his routine walk before sleep, Rail passed through a section of the station he had not needed to pass through. He was not sure why he went that way. He simply noticed that he had not looked at it yet, and he made a habit of looking at things. The cargo bay marked Section 7 was listed on the corridor panel as decommissioned. The door was sealed. There was dust on the panel, but not on the floor in front of it. The boot prints in the dust went in and did not come back out the same way. Rail looked at this for a while. Then he kept walking. Reputations on Helion Reach moved fast. The station had thousands of beings in a contained space and information. Useful, useless, and strange. Passed between them the way heat moves through metal. By the third day, most of the youth delegates had heard about the human boy and his animal. By the fourth day, 3 specific stories had attached themselves to his name and would not let go. The first happened in a corridor near the East residential block. Dura had been looking for a quiet way to correct the imbalance he felt after the cooperative exercise. Not violence. Garathi youth were formally prohibited from physical altercations on exchange stations. But presence. The use of size as a kind of grammar. He found Rail alone in a corridor between shifts and moved to stand close to him. Very close. Close enough that the height difference became impossible to ignore. You made me look bad, Dura said. Rail did not move. He was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. He looked up at Dura the way he looked at most things, steady, taking it in, not performing anything. I want you to understand, Dura continued, that on my world, what you did would have consequences. Rail said nothing. Dura was about to continue when he noticed that the animal was no longer behind the boy. He looked down. Sable had moved quietly around his left side and was now sitting directly in front of him. She was not growling. She was not showing teeth. She was simply sitting, looking up at him with those small eyes that held no fear anywhere in them. Dura had faced larger animals than this. He had faced animals with better teeth and more impressive size. But those animals had always had a fear response underneath their aggression. Some part of them always knew they could lose. He could feel it, the biological negotiation, the part where the animal calculated the cost. Sable was not calculating anything. She was simply there, patient, flat-eyed, waiting. Dura held the stare for as long as he reasonably could. Then he stepped back, said nothing, and walked the other direction. He told himself it was a tactical decision. He almost believed it that a maintenance worker had seen the whole thing through a junction camera. He sent the clip to a friend. The friend sent it to 3 others. By that evening, it had been watched by most of the station's residential population. The most common comment, translated across 6 languages, was some version of, "What is that animal?" The second incident did not involve Dura, a Velhari creature, roughly the size of a small dog, six-legged, and capable of moving fast enough to be difficult to track with the eye, escaped from a biology research lab when a containment latch failed. It panicked in the open corridor and moved toward the common areas where delegates were gathered between sessions. The response was immediate and completely understandable. Being scattered. The Velhari was not aggressive by nature, but it was fast, disoriented, and its skin secreted a contact toxin that caused severe tissue damage in most known species. Station security was called. Hazmat protocols were initiated. The corridor was being cleared. Rail walked forward, he did not run. He moved at a steady pace into the space everyone else was leaving. Sable moved with him, slightly to his left, matching his pace without instruction. The Velhari was pressed against the base of the wall, six legs scrambling, head darting back and forth. It was terrified. Rail stopped about 2 meters away and crouched down. He made himself smaller. He did not move fast. He did not make noise. He simply waited and let the creature become aware of him slowly. Sable sat beside him and was still. The Velhari's head movement slowed. It looked at the boy. It looked at the animal. Neither of them was doing anything threatening. The Velhari, like most creatures, knew the difference between a predator and a presence. Rail reached out one hand. Slowly, palm down. The Velhari moved toward it. He picked it up with both hands, stood, carried it back to the lab, and handed it to the researcher who had been standing in the corridor, looking like someone who expected to be fired. The station medic noted in the incident report that the human delegate had handled the Velhari without gloves or protective covering. The medic added a note below. Velhari contact toxin produces tissue necrosis in Toluvian, Garathi, Silvari, and most other registered species. In humans, preliminary data suggests it causes localized rash. Suggest further study. The third incident was not visible to anyone on the station. It happened on paper. Counselor Dren had filed his formal complaint about Sable 4 days earlier, citing regulations on unregistered biological entities in shared residential space. The review board convened to assess it. They pulled the corridor camera clip. They pulled the incident report from the biology lab. They read the medic's note. They looked at the existing footage of Sable over 4 days of station records that, in 4 days, the animal had not displayed aggression toward any delegate or staff member. It had not destroyed property. It had not made sounds that disturbed other residents. It had assisted, apparently without instruction, in the containment of an escaped hazardous creature. The review board tabled the complaint indefinitely. Dren read the notice with the particular expression of someone who has lost an argument they were certain they would win. He filed a secondary complaint. The review board sent him the same notice with a different date on it. That night, Rail slid a handwritten note under Admiral Voss's door. He had been carrying it for 2 days, deciding whether to send IT. IT had 3 words on it. Cargo Bay 7. He went back to his room, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and scratched behind Sable's ear while she pushed her head against his hand and made a low, quiet sound that she only made when things were calm. He was not sure how long calm would last. He thought probably not very long. Admiral Voss found the note at the start of his shift. He read it 3 times. Then he put it in his chest pocket, drank the rest of his water, and went to Cargo Bay 7 without telling anyone where he was going. He spent 11 minutes inside. When he came out, his face was doing the thing that faces do when a person knows something bad and is trying to decide exactly how bad it is before they react. He walked to his office, contacted station security through a channel that did not go through the main communications grid, and spoke for a long time in a very low voice. Inside Cargo Bay 7, behind a false partition that had been installed sometime in the past 3 weeks, there were weapons crates, communications jammers, portable barrier units, and a printed schematic of Helion Reach with 17 sections circled in red and handwritten notes beside them in a language Voss recognized as Dreven script. The Dreven pack had been banned from Helion Reach for 9 years. They had been responsible for 2 hostage situations on other stations and 1 complete seizure of a freight hub that had lasted 4 days and ended with 12 dead. They were experienced, patient, and they planned thoroughly. The fact that they had been moving material inside the station for weeks without triggering a single alert meant they had someone on the inside helping them. Voss wanted to move quietly. He wanted 48 hours to identify the informant, map the full scope of the operation, and arrange a security response that would intercept the Dreven before they activated. He had about 4 hours. The Dreven had a sensor on the false partition. When Voss opened it, a signal went out. The lockdown hit at the start of the delegate-free period when most of Helion Reach's population was spread across communal areas, corridors, and session rooms. 17 section doors sealed simultaneously. Emergency lights replaced standard lighting. A voice on the station intercom said something in Dreven, then, after a pause, repeated it in Galactic Common. All occupants remain where you are, comply with instructions. No one is harmed. In the education wing. Rael was sitting near the window reading a printed manual about station systems he had taken from Public Rack 2 days ago because it looked interesting. Lyrian was at the table beside him, reviewing session notes. A few other delegates were scattered around the room. The doors locked. The other delegates reacted the way most beings react when something frightening happens without warning. Noise, movement, clustering together, questions asked too fast to be answered. 2 Sylvari delegates near the back of the room began making a low distress sound that their species produced involuntarily under fear. A young Teluvian was pressing his communicator repeatedly even though the signal was clearly dead. Rael put down his manual that he looked at the doors. He looked at the ventilation points near the ceiling. He looked at the emergency panel on the wall, noted that its indicator light was red, meaning the lockdown was external and could not be overridden from inside. He looked at the windows, which were reinforced and sealed. He took in the dimensions of the room, the number of people in it, the positions of every entry point. This took him about 20 seconds. Then he sat back down. He put his hand on Sable, who had been still beside his chair throughout. She looked up at him once and then looked at the door. Lyrian moved to sit near him. Her glow had gone pale, which in Sylvari meant the body was managing fear. She was doing it well. Her movements were controlled, her breathing deliberate. She watched Rael's face looking for something to hold on to, the way beings do when everything around them is uncertain. His face was calm. Not performing calm, actually calm. She focused on her breathing and let that be enough. 3 Dreven soldiers came through the education wing door 12 minutes after the lockdown. They were professional about it, efficient, not cruel, using size and equipment rather than noise to establish control. They moved the delegates to one side of the room, checked for communicators, and began the standard process of cataloging who they had. 1 soldier reached Rael and stopped. He was used to reading the body language of fear. His job for the past 8 years had involved rooms full of frightened beings, and frightened beings all moved the same way. Tight shoulders, wide eyes, hands that didn't know where to go. This boy was sitting with his hands on his knees and looking at the soldier with the particular expression of someone who is listening and deciding. Stand, the soldier said. Rael stood. The soldier looked down at Sable. Something moved in his expression. What is that? Rael looked at Sable. Then back at the soldier, he said, quietly, in a language the soldier did not understand, Wag. Sable went still, completely still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of motion, but the presence of intention held in reserve. The soldier stared at the animal for 3 full seconds. Then he made a decision that was wrong but understandable. He decided the animal was not a threat, moved the group to the corner of the room under guard, and sealed the door behind the second soldier, who left to report to the section commander. 1 soldier remained. He stood by the door with his back to the wall, weapon held across his body. He watched the room. He did not watch the animal. Rael sat down. He looked at the door. He did not say Wag again. What happened next was later described in 6 different official reports, 9 delegate accounts, and 1 very confused station security debrief. None of them fully agreed on the sequence. The only account that came close to capturing it accurately was Lyrian's, and even she said afterward that she was not certain her memory was correct because she had been watching something her mind did not have a proper category for. She said it began with the door. The guard had been standing with his back to the wall for about 30 minutes when Rael stood up quietly and walked toward the emergency panel. Not fast, Not sneaking. Simply walking, the way he walked everywhere, like someone who had decided where to go and saw no reason to be dramatic about it. The guard told him to sit down. Rail crouched beside the panel instead and looked at it. He took a small tool from inside his boot, something flat and narrow that Lyrian did not recognize. He opened a section of the panel casing. The guard moved toward him with the weapon raised and said something sharper. Rail looked up at him, then at the weapon. Then he went back to the panel. Lyrian held her breath. The guard was 3 steps away when the door opened. Not the main door. The panel Rail had been working on controlled the emergency release for a maintenance access point on the left side of the room. It was a narrow door, designed for station workers, not listed on the standard schematic that the Dreven had used to plan the lockdown. Rail had read about it in the station systems manual 2 days ago, because it had looked interesting. The guard turned toward the sound. In the 2 seconds his attention shifted, Sable moved. She had been beside Rail's chair across the room. She crossed the distance before the guard completed his turn. What happened in the following moments was difficult for Lyrian to describe accurately because it happened at a speed and with a kind of focused completeness that her brain kept trying to classify as something other than what it was. The guard went down. He was not dead. He was not seriously injured. He was, however, completely unable to continue his current activity, and he was making sounds that Lyrian thought were probably the Dreven equivalent of extreme surprise. Rail zipped the guard's wrist together with a length of maintenance cord from the wall kit beside the access door. He did this quickly and without ceremony, the way someone ties a knot they have tied many times before. He checked that it held. He stood up. He looked at Sable carefully. He ran his hands along her sides and checked her face and her legs. She made a low sound and pressed into his hands. "Okay," he said. Just that. He looked at Lyrian and the other delegates. His expression said, "Come if you want, stay if you want, but I'm going now." They all came. The maintenance corridors behind the education wing ran through a section of the station the Dreven had not fully secured because it did not appear on their schematic as a transit route. Rail moved through it the way he had moved through everything since arriving on Helion Reach, reading the space, noting what he saw, keeping a pace that was fast enough to matter, but not so fast that it made noise. He had been keeping a count in his head since the lockdown started. Guard positions at the section doors. The interval between the first soldier and the second. The direction the third had gone when he left to report. These are not things he had decided to memorize. He simply noticed things, and they stayed. They reached a junction. 2 corridors branched left and right. A Dreven soldier stood at the right junction, facing away from them, watching the main corridor beyond. Rail stopped the group with one hand. He and Sable looked at the soldier at exactly the same moment, with exactly the same expression. Lyrian noticed this and filed it somewhere in her mind to think about later when there was time to think. What followed was even faster than the first time, because this time there was no moment of divided attention. Sable simply went. The soldier heard something, started to turn, and then did not finish turning. Rail secured him the same way as the first. Checked Sable. Said okay. Moved on. The communications hub was 4 junctions further. It had not been listed as a priority point in the Dreven's plan because they had cut the main communications grid at the source. What they had not cut was the direct hardline terminal, a legacy system installed when the station was first built, used now for nothing except emergency contact with station infrastructure teams. It was old enough that it did not appear on any of the Dreven's modern schematics. Rail had read about it in the manual. He patched through to Voss in under 3 minutes. He did not narrate what had happened. He gave information. The guard positions he had seen, the weapon types, the number of soldiers at each section door, the supply count from Cargo Bay 7, the number of jammers he had identified by their power signatures on the panel in the education wing. Voss was quiet for a moment after the count ended. "How do you know all this?" he said. Rail looked at the junction they had come through. He thought about all the things he had noticed since arriving on the station, all the things he had looked at simply because they were there to look at, all the things that had seemed like just being in a room, but had apparently been something else. "I was paying attention," he said. Galactic security breached the station through 3 points 17 minutes later. They moved along the route Rail had described. The operation lasted 41 minutes from first breach to full custody. No delegates were injured. 4 driven soldiers required medical attention for reasons the security team's report described as pre-existing altercations and declined to elaborate on further. In a small maintenance corridor not far from the communications hub, Sable ate from a piece of dried food Rail had taken from his pocket, and Lyrian sat against the wall feeling the slow, strange process of her body, deciding that the danger was over. She looked at the boy and his animal in the low corridor light. She had no word in her language for what she had witnessed between them. Her people communicated in feeling, and the feeling she had observed passing between Rail and Sable was not something she could name. It was older than language. It lived below words in the place where 2 creatures have spent enough time together that the space between them stops feeling like space. She thought she might spend a very long time trying to describe it. She was not sure she would succeed. The debrief room smelled like disinfectant and the particular flatness of recycled station air after a long lockdown. One by one, the youth delegates gave their accounts to a senior Toluvian security official named Orvith, who had a narrow face, old eyes, and the careful manner of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most useful information usually arrived quietly. Most delegates needed considerable time. Some required a second session. A few needed interpretation support because their distress made their language processing difficult. When Orvith reached Rail, the boy sat down, put his hands on the table, and waited. Orvith asked him to describe what had happened after the education wing lockdown. Rail described it clearly, in sequence, without embellishment and without drama. He included the guard positions, the corridor layout, the timeline. He described the maintenance access door and the legacy communications terminal. He was specific about what he knew and did not offer anything beyond that. Orvith wrote carefully throughout. When Rail finished, Orvith looked at him for a moment. The security team says your intelligence allowed them to breach without casualties. The route you described matched the actual guard deployment with near-complete accuracy. Rail nodded. How did you have so much information about the station layout? I read the system's manual. Orvith looked at him. The manual is 460 pages. I know, Rail said. Some of it was useful. Orvith wrote something down. Then he asked, can you describe the incapacitation of the 2 soldiers in the maintenance corridor? Rail looked down at Sable, who was sitting beside his chair. He looked back at Orvith. Sable handled it, he said. Orvith looked at the honey badger. Sable looked back at him. She was currently working through the last a piece of dried food and found the room neither threatening nor interesting. Orvith wrote something down and moved to the next question. Dren had been in Section 12 when the lockdown hit. He had been secured with a group of station staff and had required, by all accounts, considerable management from the people around him. He did not bring this up in any subsequent conversation. He also did not bring up Sable or the complaint he had filed. The complaint remained tabled. After a week, he quietly submitted a withdrawal form. No reason was given. Orvith did not comment on this publicly. But those who knew him said he seemed quietly satisfied when it was confirmed that on the second morning after the lockdown, Dura found Rail in the main corridor near the residential block, that he stood in Rail's path. Rail stopped. Dura was quiet for a moment. He was not performing anything. His posture was different from the previous times. No width, no weight pushed forward. He simply stood there looking at the human boy who had spent 4 days being nothing much and then, apparently, been exactly what was needed at the moment it was needed, that he raised one hand in the Garathi acknowledgement gesture. Not the formal version used between elders. The plain one. The one between equals. Rail raised one hand back. They went in separate directions. It was the most honest thing either of them had done since arriving on Helion Reach. Lyrian found Rail at the observation deck on the 3rd evening. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the railing, legs stretched out. Sable stretched across his legs with her head resting on his knee. The stars outside were doing what stars always do, burning very far away, indifferent to everything. She sat beside him. After a while she asked, "How did you stay calm through all of it?" He thought about the question genuinely, the way he thought about most things, actually considering it rather than reaching for the nearest available answer. Sable doesn't panic, he said. When things go wrong, she just deals with them. Being with her helps. Lyrian looked at the animal asleep across his legs. She trusts you completely. Yeah, Rail said. Then, after a pause, I try to deserve it. Lyrian let that sit. Her people had a concept that existed below the level of language. The idea of a bond so established that it no longer needed to announce itself, that simply existed as a fact the way gravity exists as a fact. They had a word for it, but it was not a word that translated well. She had never expected to observe it between a human and an animal. She thought she would not stop thinking about it for a very long time. 3 weeks after the incident, a formal report was filed with the Galactic Council's Youth Exchange Oversight Committee. The report covered the Dreven incursion, the security response, and the contributing factors that had limited casualties. The section covering Rail was 3 paragraphs long. It used precise, official language. It noted that intelligence provided by human youth delegate R. Dunmore, age 16, had been material in directing the security breach. It noted that 2 hostile combatants had been incapacitated prior to the security team's arrival. It noted that the means of incapacitation had been reviewed and were considered appropriate given the circumstances that I in the appendix. A junior analyst had added a note that none of the senior officials had caught before the report was distributed. It read, See supplementary file, Earth Companion Fauna. Suggested reclassification from non-threat biological to assessed asset, conditional. Below that, in an informal notes field that was technically not part of the official document, but had been submitted with it anyway, the same analyst had written, Species designation, honey badger. Classification per current registry, domesticated. Note, classification is disputed by available evidence. Voss found Rail at the observation deck late that same evening. He sat down beside him and did not say anything for a while. The station moved slowly in its orbit. The stars didn't change. They're going to ask questions about you now, Voss said finally. About humans. What you're capable of. What you're like. Rail scratched behind Sable's ear. She made a low sound and pushed into his hand. Let them ask, he said. Voss looked out at the stars. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Somewhere in the council chambers, the new file was already open. Someone was reading it. Someone else had requested a follow-up. The questions were forming, the way questions always do when something does not fit the existing understanding of the world, and the world has to decide what to do about that. Rail did not know any of this. He was watching the stars. Sable was asleep. That was enough.